to accept Churchill and Roosevelt's decision not to open a second front in Europe for the time being. But this did cause some resentment, as he believed that they were saving the blood of their soldiers while the Russians were shedding theirs for the greater good. Nevertheless, Churchill and Roosevelt had to take great care in their treatment of Stalin, because it was vital that Russia did not make another deal with Hitler. If Russia agreed to a peaceful settlement with the Germans, it would make it a great deal harder for the British and Americans to win the war. Despite there being differences of opinion between the Allied nations, Hitler's position was far from being unassailable, and early in 1943 the Red Army made significant progress when on the 31st of January the first trapped German soldiers under siege at Stalingrad surrendered. Stalin knew that he now had the upper hand and was ready to ensure that his army would continue to pile on the pressure to force a full German retreat along the whole of the Eastern Front. The Red Army finally won the battle for Stalingrad on the 2nd of February, with the complete destruction of the German Sixth Army, as, just like Napoleon before him, Hitler had failed to subjugate the Russians in their homeland. Meanwhile, Churchill and Roosevelt met in Casablanca to discuss the Allies' next move. Stalin was invited to the Casablanca conference, but declined. However, Charles de Gaulle and Henry Giraud were both there, representing the French. While confirming that opening a second European front was not yet feasible, the Allies turned their attention to other fronts where they could strike a destructive blow. To date, Montgomery's activities in North Africa were beginning to produce results, and most of the Anglo-American forces were stationed close by. As a result, the Allies believed they'd soon have control of this vital landmass, so they needed to decide what to do once Hitler and the Axis powers had been driven out of North Africa. After lengthy discussions, it was finally decided that an advance to attack Sicily and Italy would be the most logical tactical route to take, and this was one of the aims that was stated by Roosevelt in the Casablanca Declaration. The other resolutions were, firstly, the Allied demand for the unconditional surrender of the Axis, secondly, an agreement to aid the Soviet Union, and lastly, to settle the differences between de Gaulle and Giraud as they became joint leaders of the Free French. Straight away, more forces were put into the North African campaign, and the Anglo-American troops continued to beat Rommel into retreat along the coast of Africa. Because of the extra concentration on this continent, by the end of January, Rommel, who was very ill at the time, was forced back to Tunisia. Although German losses were escalating, Hitler had no intention of simply giving up on North Africa, and he dispatched a further 250,000 men and 400 aeroplanes to aid his Desert Fox in his campaign to win back North Africa. For a time, this improved Rommel's progress, and with the welcome reinforcements, he was able to launch a number of attacks with varying degrees of success. Enough was finally enough for the Desert Fox, and far from being a well man, Rommel left North Africa on the 10th of March and handed over power to General Arnim, never to return again. Meanwhile, out at sea, Hitler and the Axis powers were enjoying much more success with their U-boat offensive. Hitler knew that as long as his U-boats remained a significant threat in the Atlantic, then an Allied invasion of Western Europe would be extremely difficult, and, more importantly, Britain could still be annexed out of the war. In 3 days of intense fighting from March the 16th onwards, the German U-boats destroyed 32 Allied merchant ships. By the end of the month, they'd sunk 108 ships in total. Despite the Allies' best efforts, it looked as if Hitler was on course to win the Battle of the Atlantic. Even Churchill, with his never-say-die attitude, commented that the only thing that really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. But not, of course, at the time, waiting to speak until after the conflict was over and voice his fears. The British Royal Navy concentrated all their efforts on this problem, and they were determined not to lose this essential battle, because the consequences would be grave. Throughout April and May, the extra attention that the British had focused on the Atlantic, dating right back to 1941, was slowly beginning to pay dividends. From April, the all-important convoys from America were protected in a number of different ways, some technological and others tactical. Long-range aircraft, equipped with short-range radar and powerful searchlights, could now easily pick up surfaced U-boats, and there were also much larger concentrations of German rule. Far from making life better for the people they controlled, the Germans often abused the countries they occupied, so much so that determined resistance groups formed, who would help the Allied forces in any way that they could. Guerrilla groups were springing up all over the globe, and they were all focused on defeating Hitler and the Axis powers. Some were extremely strong, like the Yugoslavian partisans, who, along with other groups in the Balkans, were keeping 60,000 Italian troops occupied, preventing them from assisting in Hitler's essential North African offensive. Executed by the Nazis. Many small villages hid people from the Jewish community who were being systematically rounded up and killed by the Nazis. The horror of the German atrocities escalated throughout 1943, especially for people of the Jewish faith. Once the Germans occupied a country and neutralized the armed forces, they would then turn their attention to the Jews, searching them out to send them to the concentration camps. All this was part of what Hitler called the final solution for the Jewish problem in Europe. Even before war broke out, Hitler was determined to rid Europe of the Jews, and in January 1939, during a speech in the Reichstag, he stated his intentions with the following: "Today, I will once more be a prophet. If the international Jewish financiers in and outside Europe should succeed in plunging the nations once more into a world war, then the result will not be the Bolshevizing of the earth, and thus the victory of Jewry, but the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe." The gassing and mass murder of the Jews was by now a daily reality, and many death camps were in full operation. There were killing centres all over Germany, and it was thought that by the end of 1943, more than 2 million Jews had already been brutally murdered. Sadly, although they now were all too aware of what Hitler was doing, there was little the Allies could do to intervene until the Axis powers were defeated. Hitler had to be beaten as quickly as possible if these terrible crimes against humanity were to be stopped. In an effort to speed up the proceedings, more American troops were being sent to North Africa to finish the task there, and it looked as though complete victory in North Africa was now extremely close for the Allies. Even Rommel, the Desert Fox, who was now back in Berlin, was pleading with Hitler to let the troops retreat, as he considered staying and fighting to be plain suicide. Hitler, who'd always respected Rommel's tactical mind, believed that his recent illness had made him lose his nerve, and so dismissed Rommel's plea for the lives of his men. Nevertheless, the strain on Hitler was beginning to show, as he now looked considerably older than his 53 years, having developed a nervous tic due to the onslaught he was facing in North Africa and Russia. Having made such inroads, the Allies had no intention of slowing down their operations in North Africa, and thanks to Ultra, they were able to second-guess almost every single air and naval movement of the Axis in North Africa. Consequently, the Allies were able to destroy vital supplies to Hitler's troops, who were by now almost completely cut off. And the situation got so desperate, they had to resort to distilling fuel from wine and spirits to keep their remaining 100 tanks operational. American General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who'd been instrumental in planning the Allied victory, recorded a broadcast for his countrymen back home, as both Britain and the USA enjoyed a much-needed morale boost. Since the shake-up in North Africa, with Monty commanding the troops, and the arrival of American reinforcements, victory had come relatively quickly. Speed was now of the essence, and Churchill met with his North African commanders to plan the invasion of Sicily, which had been laid out in the Casablanca Declaration. Codenamed Operation Husky, it was Churchill's favoured course of action, otherwise the troops would have had to return to Britain to wait for the Second European Front to open. Churchill was keen for the Allies to capitalise on their advantage, and he definitely saw Italy as a back door into Germany, although not everyone agreed with him. But it was recognised that by occupying Italy, the balance of power could only swing even further in favour of the Allies. Operation Husky needed to be carried out at speed, because there were very few German troops in Sicily after the victory in Africa, and it was vital that the Allies struck hard and fast. However, the weeks were passing, and the invasion was yet to begin, with the clock ticking. While all the preparations were going on for Operation Husky, another operation, codenamed Chastise, was about to boost Allied morale. Although Chastise may not sound immediately familiar, when you realise that the Royal Air Force Squadron No. 617 that carried out the mission are also known as the Dam Busters, you'll certainly have heard of them, and one of the best-known events of 1943. On the 16th of May, 133 aircrew flying specially adapted Lancaster bombers took off for the German Ruhr area. Their targets were 3 dams on the Eder River, and they were carrying a revolutionary type of bouncing bomb, designed by Barnes Wallis. The mission was successful, and the resulting flooding caused havoc and certainly hampered the German war effort. The Dambuster raids were, however, costly, with 53 of the aircrew killed and 3 captured as prisoners of war. The dashing wing commander in charge of the operation, Guy Gibson, was awarded the Victoria Cross and became something of a celebrity, only to be killed on a mission in 1944. For Churchill, the public relations implications couldn't have been better timed, helping to convince the Americans and the Russians that Britain was capable of being an effective ally. Also, for those on the home front still being bombed every night by the Luftwaffe, it felt like sweet revenge, while the hardship caused in Germany as a result dented public morale considerably. It was now becoming evident that Adolf Hitler was not as invincible as he'd made everyone believe, and matters continued to deteriorate for the Führer. There was further good news for the Allies from the Atlantic on the 22nd of May, when Grand Admiral Dönitz withdrew all his U-boats from the North Atlantic. 33 U-boats had been destroyed in May alone, and to make matters worse, the Germans were sinking fewer Allied ships. Dönitz was forced to accept the fact that the lengthy campaign to destroy the Allied supply lines from America had failed. The submarines that were withdrawn from the North Atlantic were sent south in the hope of greater success from there, but the British Navy, with Ultra, new intelligence systems and various tactical and technological innovations, were always just one step ahead. Tank battle, the Red Army stopped the Germans dead in their tracks, having taken only 12 miles of land. While the Germans were slowing down in Russia, the Americans were only just getting started in the Pacific. It was essential to step up operations to, at the very least, keep the Japanese under control until the war in Europe had been won. The Americans had been working hard to push the Japanese back towards their homeland, starting with the battle for the East Solomons in August. Through the course of many sea battles, the Americans hoped to push beyond the Solomon Islands towards New Guinea, and then reach the Philippines before moving towards mainland Japan. The American admirals called the tactic leapfrogging, as the US forces would hop from island to island as they pushed ever closer to Japan. The many islands that are scattered across the Pacific actually helped the Americans in their campaign. The only way to get supplies and men onto an occupied island at speed and in any numbers was by carrier. However, these were easy targets for the American dive bombers, and after several losses, the Japanese no longer dared to send in ships when the Americans were on the offensive. This meant that once the Americans were attacking an island, all they needed to do was neutralize the stronghold from the air or sea before moving on to the next one. They could safely do this because the Japanese wouldn't risk their shipping to counterattack. During 1943, the Pacific Ocean was a busy place, and not just in the south. Further north, the activities of the US Navy were just as strategic. There were American divisions positioned on a number of the Aleutian Islands, and from here the Americans could now move down from the north to close in on the Japanese from two sides. The Americans had a luxury that few other countries could afford at the time, which was a seemingly endless supply of men and armaments. By 1943, the Americans were producing over 85,000 aircraft, which was almost as many as Britain, Russia, Germany and Japan put together. And they were also leading the way in shipping and tank production. Because of these huge numbers and no shortage of men enlisting in the armed forces, the US were able to position men on many vital fronts all around the world. As the American forces were hard at work dominating the North and South Pacific, they were also ready to take part in the invasion of Sicily on the 10th of July. The Allies had been preparing for many weeks by carrying out air raids on the island and neutralising the Luftwaffe. When the enemy positions in Sicily were sufficiently damaged, it was time for one of the greatest seaborne invasions of the war. As 3,000 ships headed towards the Mediterranean island, many of the soldiers, who would have been rescued from Dunkirk some 3 years earlier, were ready to once again face the Germans on occupied soil. By dawn, Operation Husky was going to plan, and 150 Allied troops were safely ashore, with 320,000 ready to join them over the next 2 months. Sicily, but they were not to be underestimated, being veterans from the war in North Africa and some of his finest soldiers. They might have only been small in numbers, but they could still prove to be a formidable threat. The plan was that Allied troops would land in the southeast and west of the island. Then the divisions could head as quickly as possible for Messina, preventing many of the Axis forces from escaping to Italy via the Messina Straits. And Italians were not totally beaten, and that they needed to be prepared for what might be a long battle to make their way up through Italy. The Allies knew they would have to keep piling on the pressure if they stood any chance of crushing Hitler's New World Order. To make matters worse, American General George S. Patton, who'd successfully commanded the US 7th Army in the mission, was replaced by a less effective general. Eisenhower, who was his commander, had a very difficult incident to deal with when Patton visited an army hospital to commend the men for their bravery. When he encountered 2 men with shell shock, what today we would describe as post-traumatic stress, he slapped the 2 US soldiers and shouted abuse at them. The outburst almost ruined the controversial general, but when Eisenhower suggested he apologize to the men personally in front of all those who witnessed the bizarre event, Patton did as he was told. Ironically, Patton could well have been suffering from post-traumatic stress himself, and Eisenhower's timely intervention meant that he could call on Patton at a later date, when a full-scale Allied invasion of Europe was ordered. Meanwhile, back in Russia, the Red Army were continuing to push back the Germans and seemed to be making daily gains. And then, on the 23rd of August, a massive 224-gun salute was fired in Moscow to signal the recapture of the important Ukrainian city of Kharkov. On the same day, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, American President Roosevelt, and the Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie King officially announced that a second front would be opened in France against the Germans as momentum gathered for the Allies. But it wasn't only in Europe that advances were being made. In the Pacific, the Americans were continuing to fight with great success. On the 4th of September, Allied troops seized a key port in New Guinea. Australian and American troops, just as had happened in Sicily, used counterintelligence tactics rather than brute force to achieve their objective. The Australians covered up their plan to attack the port of Lae by threatening the nearby town of Salamua. The Japanese logically took defences away from Lae to protect the threatened town. So when the Allies landed, they met little resistance and continued to push ever closer towards Japan. Back in Europe, on the 3rd of September, the first few Allied troops landed at the toe of Italy, and the invasion of the mainland seemed as if it would be swift and easy. Some Italian soldiers even helped to unload the Allied ships. The Italians no longer wanted to fight Hitler's battle, and on the same day they secretly signed an armistice with the Allies in Sicily. The wind of change was sweeping across Italy. Benito Mussolini was stripped of his power in July, and now many of his countrymen viewed him as the most hated man in Italy. Mussolini had promised the Italians victory and a new empire. Instead, all he delivered were humiliating defeats in East Africa, Albania, Greece, Egypt, Libya, and Tunisia. On the 8th of September, the armistice was made official. The Germans also swiftly occupied Rome, and despite 5 Italian divisions being placed there to protect the city from their old brothers in arms, they were soon overpowered by the Nazi invaders. The Germans were disgusted by what they considered to be the Italians' cowardly way out of the war, and brutally dealt with any Italian soldiers who tried to put up a fight as they were being disarmed. But this was only a part of a much bigger picture, and the Allies continued their bombing raids on enemy cities. They were continuously stepping up their bombing initiatives, and were now attacking the Mediterranean as well as Europe. New and ever more destructive bombs were being produced, and 1943 was the year when major efforts were made by the Americans developing their nuclear program to produce an atomic bomb. Many important German cities now lay in ruins, and millions of German families had to be evacuated, causing terrible hardship for the civilian population caught up in the conflict. Sadly, this, as always, was the price of warfare. Yet if there was to be an Allied victory, removing the threat of Adolf Hitler to world peace for good, it was a cost that had to be borne. As one RAF pilot so eloquently put it, "No regrets. Remember what the Nazis did to London." And it was a sentiment that the Allies had to take to heart if they were going to march on to victory. The civilians of Naples were in dire need. The fighting had destroyed the sewage systems, and the 1 million people who lived there were now threatened by outbreaks of deadly epidemics, and food was in very short supply. For the Allies, it was another stark reminder that in war, civilians are always the hardest hit. The Germans had already moved to the north of the city to ensure they held a good defensive line, so there was very little fighting in the streets of Naples between the Germans and Allies. The autumn weather was now beginning to set in, and this, coupled with the hilly terrain, was slowing the Allied forces' progress. But there were no such setbacks for the Americans in the Pacific, as they continued to beat back the Japanese. Despite their Europe-first strategy, the Americans had become a powerful force in the Pacific and were determined to keep the Japanese threat at bay. Their power and sheer weight of numbers meant that they could advance with 2 thrusts in the South Pacific. One task force could work up from New Guinea, while the other moved across the centre. The Americans were gaining considerable ground, and their island-hopping tactic was proving to be extremely successful. Churchill was so positive about an Allied victory that for the first time he set up a meeting to discuss how the Pacific must now be officially tackled. On the 25th of November, in Cairo, Churchill and Roosevelt met with the Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek to discuss what the next moves would be in the Pacific. The Allied leaders knew that the time to strike had never been more auspicious, and that 1944 would be a vital year in their campaign. A few days later, Stalin made his first journey outside of Russia since 1917 to join Churchill and Roosevelt in Tehran to discuss in greater detail the Second Front in Europe. After some intense talks, an announcement was made stating that the 3 leaders have concerted plans for the destruction of the German forces. We have reached complete agreement as to the scope and timing of the operations, which will be undertaken from the east, west and south. They talked about the Second European Front that would definitely happen in 1944, and it also made it clear that the Allies would continue to work their way up through Italy to meet the Germans in the south. Stalin also agreed that once German forces were beaten in Russia, he would turn his attentions to the battle against the Japanese. The tide had truly turned in favour of the Allies, and for Hitler and his Axis powers, the dreams of world domination now looked unlikely to become a reality. As 1943 drew to a close, the Russians were celebrating a year of advances for the Red Army, as the Germans were pushed ever further back towards Poland. Next, Stalin was planning to clear the Ukraine early in 1944, before marching into Poland, Romania, and finally Germany itself. But unfortunately, in Italy, the Allied advances were not going quite so well. However, things were progressing, if a little slowly, and this was a time of great hope. The Allies were not yet in Rome, and the Germans were putting up a brave fight. By the end of the year, the Allies had only managed to advance 70 miles north of their main landing points in Salerno. Nevertheless, although they may not have been moving at blitzkrieg speed, they were still making progress, and the Germans were continuing to slowly retreat. Also at the Tehran conference, the finer details of Operation Overlord had been laid down, and the campaign was really beginning to gather momentum. For this to become a decisive action that would herald the end of the war, a truly massive invasion force would have to be ready before the middle of 1944 in order to take Hitler and the German army by storm. On Christmas Eve, it was announced that the man chosen to be the supreme Allied commander in Europe was American General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who'd been responsible for overseeing Operation Husky. There'd been some disagreement between Roosevelt and Churchill over this, as the British Prime Minister had a preference for General Montgomery. But in the end, it was Stalin who had the casting vote. That Eisenhower was capable was beyond question, with his affable style and quiet confidence. As he'd already proved, he could handle commanding such diverse characters as the difficult Monty and Old Blood and Guts Patton, as the American general was nicknamed. It was, with the benefit of hindsight, a very good choice. The task ahead was so great that all of these men would need to work together if Hitler was to be beaten, and there was none more qualified to lead them than Eisenhower, despite the fact he'd not seen active service in his entire military career. The newly appointed Supreme Allied Commander of Europe was a superb administrator and strategist, and the responsibility for winning the peace now lay squarely on his shoulders, as 1944 promised to bring with it. 1944 was a year that began full of promise for the Allies, as the war was beginning to slip from the grasp of Adolf Hitler and the Axis powers, and many believed that by the end of the year peace might well be restored throughout Europe. During 1943, the fifth year the world had been at war, the Allied nations had, at last, turned the tide against Hitler, and it was now time to consolidate their much improved position. Germany, after bitter hand-to-hand fighting and terrible casualties on both sides, had been forced to retreat from Russia after the Battle of Stalingrad, and with the Red Army poised to now push into Poland, the Nazis were quite literally on the run. Likewise, the Allies were making good progress in Italy since the fall of Rommel's Afrika Korps in 1943. The North African conflict involved many tough desert engagements, and at one point it looked as though Rommel's superior military leadership was going to guarantee another Axis victory on this all-important but often overlooked continent. However, with grit, determination and clever strategy, with the Allies led by such legendary generals as Montgomery from Britain and Eisenhower from America, the Afrika Korps finally surrendered as the Axis fled to Sicily. The Allies then continued their push into Europe, invading first Sicily and then Italy for a campaign that was expected to be swift, but progress was slower than had been hoped for. As 1943 drew to a close, it had been hoped that the Allies would be in Rome by January, but as 1944 began, they were still locked in a desperate battle in central Italy and were many miles from the historic capital. Also, fighting was still intense in the Pacific, where the American Navy had been battling the Japanese ever since the devastation of Pearl Harbor had brought the USA into World War II at the end of 1941. Nevertheless, the Allied leaders, Winston Churchill, Franklin D. Roosevelt and Joseph Stalin, had all taken time out from their individual schedules at the end of 1943 to agree an Allied invasion of France to take place in 1944, and consequently plans for Operation Overlord, the code name for the long-awaited invasion, were beginning to get underway. If the Allies were looking for good omens, they didn't have to wait very long, because on the 6th of January, a number of along the line. Hitler's ever-expanding German Empire was finally being clawed back, and his troops, far from returning to the fatherland as conquering heroes, were now retreating in defeat. It was a year that began full of promise for the Allies, as the war was beginning to slip from the grasp of Adolf Hitler and the Axis powers, and many believed that by the end of the year, peace might well be restored throughout Europe. During 1943, the 5th year the world had been at war, the Allied nations had, at last, turned the tide against Hitler, and it was now time to consolidate their much improved position. Germany, after bitter hand-to-hand fighting and terrible casualties on both sides, had been forced to retreat from Russia after the Battle of Stalingrad, and with the Red Army poised to now push into Poland, the Nazis were quite literally on the run. Likewise, the Allies were making good progress in Italy since the fall of Rommel's Afrika Korps in 1943. The North African conflict involved many tough desert engagements, and at one point it looked as though Rommel's superior military leadership was going to guarantee another Axis victory on this all-important but often overlooked continent. However, with grit, determination and clever strategy, with the Allies led by such legendary generals as Montgomery from Britain and Eisenhower from America, the Afrika Korps finally surrendered as the Axis fled to Sicily. The Allies then continued their push into Europe, invading first Sicily and then Italy for a campaign that was expected to be swift, but progress was slower than had been hoped for. As 1943 drew to a close, it had been hoped that the Allies would be in Rome by January, but as 1944 began, they were still locked in a desperate battle in central Italy and were many miles from the historic capital. Also, fighting was still intense in the Pacific, where the American Navy had been battling the Japanese ever since the devastation of Pearl Harbor had brought the USA into World War II at the end of 1941. Nevertheless, the Allied leaders, Winston Churchill, Franklin D. Roosevelt and Joseph Stalin, had all taken time out from their individual schedules at the end of 1943 to agree an Allied invasion of France to take place in 1944, and consequently plans for Operation Overlord, the code name for the long-awaited invasion, were beginning to get underway. If the Allies were looking for good omens, they didn't have to wait very long, because on the 6th of January, a number of along the line. Hitler's ever-expanding German Empire was finally being clawed back, and his troops, far from returning to the fatherland as conquering heroes, were now retreating in defeat. The Red Army had taken back 400 miles of land in just 6 months, and if they continued at the same rate, they would not only push through Poland, but also take the fighting to the Germans on their home soil as well. In fact, only 13 men were lost in the landings, the majority as a result of landmines. Yet the Allies failed to seize the initiative, and instead of breaking out quickly towards Rome, the commanders spent days strengthening their beachhead. This proved to be a costly mistake, and although tactics and preparation are key in any military operation, speed was far more important on this occasion. Without speed, Hitler's blitzkrieg attacks with his panzer divisions never would have taken Europe by storm back in 1939, nor would the Japanese have caused such a stir in the Pacific. The lives of over 1 million civilians were lost, and the city had been decimated. Yet for those who survived at last, here was living proof that Hitler's regime could be beaten. The Red Army was equally active in the south of Russia, and all the Germans could really do was hold ground. Concentrating on building fortifications in specific towns, the Nazis attempted to stem the tide. Roosevelt and Joseph Stalin had all taken time out from their individual schedules at the end of 1943 to agree an Allied invasion of France to take place in 1944, and consequently plans for Operation Overlord, the code name for the long-awaited invasion, were beginning to get underway. If the Allies were looking for good omens, they didn't have to wait very long, because on the 6th of January, a number of along the line. Hitler's ever-expanding German Empire was finally being clawed back, and his troops, far from returning to the fatherland as conquering heroes, were now retreating in defeat. The Red Army had taken back 400 miles of land in just 6 months, and if they continued at the same rate, they would not only push through Poland, but also take the fighting to the Germans on their home soil as well. In fact, only 13 men were lost in the landings, the majority as a result of landmines. Yet the Allies failed to seize the initiative, and instead of breaking out quickly towards Rome, the commanders spent days strengthening their beachhead. This proved to be a costly mistake, and although tactics and preparation are key in any military operation, speed was far more important on this occasion. Without speed, Hitler's blitzkrieg attacks with his panzer divisions never would have taken Europe by storm back in 1939, nor would the Japanese have caused such a stir in the Pacific. The lives of over 1 million civilians were lost, and the city had been decimated. Yet for those who survived at last, here was living proof that Hitler's regime could be beaten. The Red Army was equally active in the south of Russia, and all the Germans could really do was hold ground. Concentrating on building fortifications in specific towns, the Nazis attempted to stem the tide. But the truth was, the Axis powers in Russia were slowly but surely being forced into retreat. The same problems were facing Hitler's Axis partners, the Japanese in the Pacific, who were finding it impossible to protect all the islands they'd previously seized. The Americans, with their massive navy, could continue to island hop with great success, and were constantly launching attacks on the Pacific Islands. A major target in the sights of the US Navy were the Marshall Islands in the Central Pacific, and with 297 ships, over 1,000 aircraft, all supported by more than 54,000 men, the Americans took the islands by force, with the first island secured at record speed without a single US loss. At this stage, the Americans knew that until Europe was liberated, they would have to fight on against the Japanese without Allied reinforcements, so containment was vital throughout 1944, while Operation Overlord became the Allies' main focus. The positive news from the Pacific would certainly help the Allied cause, but it was essential the British in Italy stepped up a gear. Winston Churchill, Britain's Prime Minister, was furious over what little ground the Allies had taken since Operation Shingle was launched, declaring that, "We hurled a wildcat on the shores of Anzio, and all we have is a stranded whale." Churchill was always conscious of how small the British forces were compared to the Americans and Russians, and he wanted to prove that what they might lack in numbers, they made up for in courage and ability. The Allies in Italy had been pushed back towards the sea, and there was now much more than gaining ground at stake. The RAF stepped up their bombing campaigns over vital Italian locations in the hope of breaking down German defences to allow the Allies the time they needed to break out from the beachhead. The bombing raids, along with an injection of more Allied troops, ensured that on the 2nd of March the Germans had to simply win the war as quickly as possible, and bombing, although an indiscriminate attack, caused the maximum amount of damage at devastating speed. Interestingly, after the war, there was a sense of national guilt over these air attacks, and Bomber Harris was the only major British commander not to be awarded a peerage, while the bomber aircrews were also denied a distinctive medal of their own. Whatever we today consider to be the rights or wrongs of bombing civilian targets, in 1944 the time had come for the Allies to do whatever was necessary to stop Adolf Hitler and his megalomania, and as plans for Operation Overlord were completed, the outcome of World War II could still swing in either direction. The man charged with the weighty task of being Supreme Allied Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force was American General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who'd already proved himself capable of handling the likes of the opinionated Montgomery and the flamboyant Patton. Interestingly, Eisenhower, unlike those he'd commanded so successfully, had not seen active service, but was a superb administrator with the added bonus of an affable personality. His efforts to meet the men he commanded in the field were greatly appreciated, and as the preparations for Operation Overlord came to fruition, every single one of them, from the lowest rank to a 5-star general, would be needed if the Allies were going to win the war. One of the most important decisions had been about which route the proposed invasion of France should take. Some favoured the shortest option, from Dover to Calais, which is what the Germans anticipated, But the actual destination selected was the Normandy coast between Caen and Cherbourg. To throw the Germans off the scent, though, for every air reconnaissance flight over Normandy, 2 flew over the Pas-de-Calais, and it was a ploy that evidently worked. Once in France, the troops would break out from the beaches with 2 thrusts, meeting up to march on the vital coal-producing area of the Ruhr in western Germany, before marching into the German heartland and finally Berlin. But there was one major obstacle that had to be overcome before the advance on Normandy could be achieved. Along the beautiful coastline, there was a distinct shortage of harbours, making the invasion plan logistically very difficult. A number of highly skilled engineers came up with the idea of using a floating harbour, and 2 of these floating harbours, or mulberries as they were codenamed, were created, one to be located in the American sector and the other in the British. With the plan for D-Day set, the Allies now needed to concentrate on gathering up the men and machinery required, and perhaps even more importantly, keep the whole operation hidden from German intelligence. Eisenhower envisaged the eventual landing of over 2 million troops onto the beaches of Normandy, so soldiers were flown in from America, Canada, and other Allied nations. The men were greeted with jubilant cheers by British civilians as they headed for the south coast, where they'd be stationed until the time was right for Operation Overlord to proceed. While the Allies were hard at work making their preparations, the Germans in France were working equally determinedly to be in a position to thwart the invasion that they knew was coming. Despite Rommel's failure to hold the North African territories for Hitler, the Desert Fox, as he was affectionately known, was still one of Hitler's most prized commanders, and he was put in charge of organising the German defences in France. However, after so many years at war, the Nazis didn't have the time or resources to protect their territory sufficiently. They had no idea as to where the Allies would attack, so had to stretch their defences thinly across the beaches of northern France, and many of the German bunkers were built on or above beaches that not a single Allied soldier would step foot on. Even so, with all the defensive precautions Rommel was putting in place, Hitler was now very confident about the whole matter, certain that a cross-channel invasion would be stopped, so that all the divisions he'd brought to France could be returned to the Russian front. Across the English Channel, though, Winston Churchill was feeling nowhere near as optimistic. He was concerned that the invasion plan was too grand, and if the Allies put everything they had into this operation, and it failed, the war would be lost. However, persuaded by the Americans and Russians to go ahead with Operation Overlord, Churchill once more rallied the people of Britain to give everything for this make-or-break mission. As spring and summer of 1944 approached, the Allied soldiers worked constantly to increase their skills and knowledge of warfare. They were frequently reminded of the vital importance of this mission, and Eisenhower made numerous visits to the troops to ensure that all was going to plan. By May, the forces in Britain were ready for anything. They'd trained long and hard for many months, and were fully prepared for the invasion. Also, thousands of ships, aircraft and vehicles had congregated along the south coast, and Eisenhower seemed suitably impressed with what had been achieved, joking that it was only the number of barrage balloons floating constantly in British skies that kept the island from sinking under the waves. Everywhere people looked, there was row upon row of military equipment, and British civilians got used to sharing their island with this impressive arsenal. The Allies had gathered 1,200 fighting ships, 12,000 aircraft, 4,000 landing aircraft, and 800 cargo ships. This was beyond anything the Germans could counterattack with, as they no longer had the raw materials or manpower for such an enterprise. But before any invasion could begin in earnest, the Allies had to clear the path for the landing parties. The American and British air forces carried out a number of bombing raids on significant German-held targets in France, including the all-important French railways, which the Germans relied on for transporting supplies. The French resistance also played their part on the ground, as they eagerly waited for the Allies to liberate them from the much-hated Nazi occupation, an indignity they'd now suffered since 1940. Keeping Operation Overlord secret was not an easy task, with so much activity going on in southern England, with so many men and so much equipment, and there was an incident that to this day has never been explained that suggested the Germans knew the whole plot. In a series of crosswords in the Daily Telegraph, code words used for the forthcoming invasion started to appear. First of all, the code names for two of the landing beaches appeared together, Utah and Omaha, making British intelligence very suspicious indeed. Then, when the word Overlord itself appeared in the same crossword with Mulberry, the code name for the artificial harbours, alarm bells really did start ringing. But no one was more surprised than the English teacher who set the clues when MI5 arrived at his house to question him. In the end, the incident was put down to coincidence, but so close to D-Day, it was very worrying indeed. Fortunately for the Allies, events were looking brighter elsewhere in Europe, as the British and American forces were finally making headway in Italy. The Allies had an incredibly tough time in Italy, but their efforts finally paid off when they captured Rome on the 4th of June. The 2 million Roman civilians were ecstatic with the arrival of the Allied troops, as one of the most important cities held by Hitler and his Axis powers had been liberated. The Pope even joined in the celebrations by announcing, "Yesterday Rome was trembling for her sons and daughters. Today she is able to look with renewed hope and faith to her salvation." All that was now needed was the order to go, as the Allied troops were moved into position, ready to respond to the call that would ultimately determine the outcome of World War II. But despite the meticulous preparation, planned to coincide with the best possible tides, the elements took a hand in history. As the 5th of June dawned, it was evident that what should have been pleasant early summer weather was anything but. The storms hitting the south coast of England and the north coast of France were horrendous, and definitely unseasonable. In fact, the last thing that anyone could have predicted. Consequently, with all the troops already aboard their ships, Operation Overlord had to be postponed, but the window of opportunity for the Allies was very small indeed. The invasion force had to set out when there was a low tide in the early hours of the morning. The only days in June that allowed for this were the 5th and 6th, and then the 19th and 20th, and the prospect of keeping the operation secret for another 2 weeks was not an option anyone wanted to contemplate. When the forecast was little better for the next day, and Eisenhower was told of a small gap in the bad weather that gave Overlord a slim chance, he gave the order to go, as D-Day, the 6th of June 1944, went down in history. Even so, the atrocious weather wasn't all bad news for the Allies, because it really did mean they had the element of surprise on their side. Rommel was so convinced the Allies wouldn't attempt an invasion in such poor conditions, he actually went home to Germany for his wife's birthday party. The Germans had also been tipped off about the radio messages that would be broadcast by the BBC to let the French resistance know that the invasion was coming, and even when this happened on the 1st and the 5th of June, the Germans still refused to believe the Allied troops were on their way. As the ship sailed across the stormy sea, the men had a little time for thought and reflection. The assault of German aircraft that the Allies were expecting were nowhere to be seen, and with the anti-aircraft guns pointed to the skies, not a single shot was fired. Much of this was due to the remarkable achievements of the RAF with their Spitfire and Lancaster bombers, making sure that not one Luftwaffe plane flew over the invasion fleet, because this would have without doubt given the Germans notice that they were about to be attacked. Interestingly, although when you mention D-Day people think first of the Navy and the Army, the air forces of Britain and America made vital contributions to the success of Operation Overlord. The American Air Force dropped paratroopers into the area around Cherbourg, close to the beaches of Utah and Omaha, where the American troops were due to come ashore. Sadly, many paratroopers drowned, as Rommel had flooded any suitable landing areas in the district, and one of the paratroopers, Private Steele, famously got caught on the church spire at St. Mary Église, where to this day a replica of him can be found to commemorate the events of D-Day. At the other end of the landing beaches, near Caen, the British 6th Airborne Division were given the task of taking a strategically important bridge after landing under the cover of darkness in silent Horsa gliders. Major John Howard and his men landed on target and won the first victory of the Normandy campaign, achieving their objective, and ever since this has been known as Pegasus Bridge in honour of the flying horse insignia of the British 6th Airborne Division. Back at sea, As the invasion fleet got ever closer to the beaches of Normandy, the Germans finally realized what was happening, and they launched everything they could at the Allies. The sea was covered with a thick, dark smoke, as both sides tried to inflict the greatest amount of damage possible before the ships reached land. The Germans had spent many years building up their empire, and were not about to give everything up without a fight. The Allies were, however, well prepared, and battleships and aircraft worked tirelessly to prepare the way for the landing craft. So once the smoke began to settle, the first carriers were edged closer to the beaches, covering a 50-mile stretch of coastline with 5 main landing beaches. From Utah and Omaha, where the Americans would land, through to Gold, Juneau and Sword, where the British and Canadians would fight, the task ahead was colossal, and unfortunately the poor weather took its toll, as the landing craft were tossed about like corks in the choppy sea, and there was hardly a soldier who wasn't sick before reaching the beaches. When the doors of the landing craft swung open, the troops who had been aboard ship for over 70 hours spilled out, wet, cold and seasick, unaware of what kind of reception was there to meet them. The men waded through the water and headed to the beaches as quickly as possible, and what they encountered depended as much upon luck as judgment. Some of the beaches, most notably Utah, were relatively unprotected, and the Allied losses were minimal, while other soldiers wouldn't even have a chance to get out of the water before being gunned down by the Germans. The worst conditions were faced by the American troops who landed on Omaha Beach, where they were met by an elite German infantry division on maneuvers in the area, and almost 3,000 American soldiers were slaughtered within a matter of hours. The storms were also inflicting serious damage on the landing craft, and many of them capsized in the rough sea as soldiers had to be dragged to safety. Also, the intelligence the Allies had received wasn't always accurate. At Pointe du Hoc, an American Ranger division battled their way up steep cliffs to take out what was believed to be a huge battery. But when they reached the top, the German guns had already been removed, and the many who'd lost their lives in the effort had in effect been sacrificed unnecessarily. What with the bad weather, the injuries already sustained, and the loss of equipment to the stormy sea, it could well have appeared that halfway through the first day of Operation Overlord, the landings were not achieving what had been hoped for. Nevertheless, this was a huge undertaking, and the strength of Overlord always relied upon its scale, and by the end of June the 6th, over 156,000 Allied troops had successfully landed on the beaches, and there were many more to come. In no time at all, laden with equipment, troops began to move off the beaches and into the French countryside. By marching 20 or so miles inland, the divisions were able to link up so that a massive beachhead could be formed, ready for the next step of the invasion plan. On the 7th of June, the weather finally started to improve, and as a result a great deal of equipment could now be brought onto the beaches, as the Allied troops swiftly neutralised the Nazi defences in the first few days of the landings. They were able to do this with relative ease because so many of the elite German forces were busy fighting the Allies in Italy and on the Eastern Front, with many of those stationed in Normandy being conscripted schoolboys with no military experience whatsoever. Within hours, there was a steady flow of Allied soldiers into Normandy, and more were due to come. Today, you can still see the remains of the Mulberry built at Gold Beach in the British sector, but the one at Omaha was actually destroyed in the bad weather. As well as the sea route, the landing force also had to make sure that there were safe locations for planes to land and take off from. Temporary airstrips were constructed and were quickly operational. After the initial upsets, everything seemed to be going to plan, and the troops were pouring onto the beaches in northern France. By the 14th of June, there were over 500,000 soldiers on the beaches of Normandy, and despite the hardships faced by the Allied troops, not least the appalling weather, the landings had been a triumphant success. For the Allied leaders, especially Eisenhower, who'd taken full responsibility for Operation Overlord, in the face of Winston Churchill's misgivings, the relief must have been immense. It's interesting to note that sometime later, after Eisenhower had announced to the world that Operation Overlord had succeeded, a speech was found, probably written by Eisenhower on the morning of June the 6th, which simply said that Overlord had failed, and the troops, whether Army, Navy or Air Force, were not to blame, and the fault, if there were any, lay totally with him. As French towns along the Normandy coastline were steadily liberated, and Hitler's reign of terror was coming to an end, the German Führer was still capable of unleashing his anger on the British, from where the invasion had come. Hitler had always promised his people a secret weapon, and the Nazis were in desperate need of such a device if they stood any chance of fighting back after D-Day. The weapon he unveiled was the V1 Flying Buzz Bomb, and the world had seen nothing like it before, and initially it was able to devastate many targets in London. The V1 was an unpiloted rocket that could be launched from sites across mainland Europe over the Channel to Britain, Hitler's intended target. The bomb was a technological marvel, and those not sent running in fear of the bomb were awestruck by this devastating yet seemingly futuristic device. Luckily, despite the initial panic they caused, many of these bombs were shot down before they hit their targets, and only a third of the 2,452 V1s launched in June ever reached their destination. Although the bomb was causing a number of casualties, Germany couldn't produce and launch the numbers of V1 bombs needed to cause any real problem for the British at this late stage in the war. Even though the V1 was not going to win the war for the Germans, the troops in Normandy were still extremely concerned at what was going on back in Britain. They wanted to waste no time in breaking out of their beachhead as quickly as possible to end the war before more damage was done to their loved ones back home. In the early weeks after the D-Day landings, the Allies were able to advance quickly. The British, with General Montgomery at the helm, marched towards Caen, but this proved to be a much harder fought battle, as the invasion force finally met with much stronger Nazi opposition. And they could still win the war. It was mid-July, and there were now over 1 million men who'd landed on the beaches of Normandy, and because of these huge numbers, Allied divisions could be sent to fight anywhere they were required. Fast, it became evident that they were the ones that now needed a miracle if they were to stand any chance of holding on to France as an occupied territory. There was also great news from Russia, as by the 31st of July, the Red Army were only 12 miles from the Polish capital of Warsaw. In fact, as early as April 1944, the Russians had recovered almost all of their pre-war territory and were working hard to liberate other countries in Europe. The Red Army were now far superior to the fleeing Germans, and with the Second Front underway in France, Stalin knew it was only a matter of time before the Nazi army would be completely crushed. The Americans had also made many significant advances in the Pacific as well, and in the summer had occupied a vital territory, which would enable them to directly attack the home islands of Japan. For the Allies, the American fighting forces took the important Saipan Islands in the Marianas, which were only 1,200 miles from Tokyo, which allowed their B-29 bombers to launch safely and begin bombing raids on Japan. For the first time since Japan entered the war, the Allies could now directly attack their homeland, and while the Allies in Europe got ever closer to Germany, the Axis powers of evil that even at the beginning of 1944 had still appeared an impossible enemy to overcome were now seriously facing defeat on all sides. Hitler was clutching at straws to stay in the war now. It had been months since a successful counterattack had been launched, and his troops on every front were retreating. In the Pacific, the Japanese were being resistance in the country. By September, the Germans had lost 500,000 men, and the Allies half that number, with fighting still intense in places. And although many believed that the war had now been won towards the end of September, the Allies, under Montgomery's command, were given a stark reminder as to why the Nazis should never be underestimated. The Allies suffered heavy losses as a result of Operation Market Garden, a mission aimed at securing the many bridges in Belgium to create a clear path all the way to the North German plain. Montgomery even wanted to go home for Christmas, believing that an Allied victory was a foregone conclusion. However, again the Allies were underestimating the enemy, and Hitler came up with one last major counterattack that would prove very costly indeed. The Führer's strategy was not dissimilar to his invasion of France way back in 1940, when he attacked the enemy from behind their defensive lines. Hitler gathered together 600 tanks and 200,000 men, ready to attack through the Ardennes, recapture Antwerp, and then hopefully split the Allies in two and push them back towards the sea, just as he had at Dunkirk. It was a high-risk strategy, and Hitler's dwindling resources meant he was some way short of the number of men and tanks required for the mission to succeed. But Hitler was by now anything but rational, and would without doubt fight to the last, launching his attack on the Allies on 16th of December. The attack at first took the Allies totally by surprise. It had been planned in complete radio silence, so even with Ultra, British intelligence had failed to intercept any information. Consequently, the Battle of the Ardennes, forever known in popular culture as the Battle of the Bulge, proved conclusively that the Nazi war machine still had a sting in the tail. The Americans were thrown into panic and confusion as the Germans attacked, and the majority of the casualties inflicted on the US divisions during the entire battle were sustained in the first 3 days. Hitler really believed, as 1944 drew to a close, that he had a fighting chance of forcing the Allies to negotiate a peace treaty in favour of the Axis powers. That Hitler was losing what little grasp he had left on reality by this stage is without doubt, and as the war headed towards a climax, the human suffering of those who'd already lived through 6 years of conflict worsened dramatically at the hands of the desperate Nazis. Like a wounded animal, Hitler's regime was very dangerous indeed, and although there was hope on the horizon for the Allies, there was still a great deal to be done if the threat posed by the Nazis was to be removed once and for all. Nevertheless, the people of Britain knew that the war was coming to an end, as the Home Guard was discharged and pre-war street lamps were replaced. Thoughts of loved ones returning, and the prospect of a new year bringing the promise of peace, was the best Christmas present anyone could have hoped for, not only in Britain,